The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's night shift hum their familiar drone at 2:03 a.m. as Sarah Chen moves through the third-floor ICU with the efficient silence of someone who has learned that invisibility is survival. Her scrubs are pressed so sharply they could cut paper. Her dark hair pulled into a regulation-tight bun reveals a faint scar along her jawline she never explains to anyone who asks, and most people stopped asking years ago. She checks vitals on room 304 with the muscle memory of someone who has done this exact sequence 10,000 times before: blood pressure cuff, pulse oximeter, temperature strip, for line inspection, ventilator settings confirmation. The work is a prayer she never says out loud. 3 years. That's how long Sarah has been deliberately choosing the night shift at Mercy General, the quiet hours between midnight and dawn when most people sleep and the hospital belongs to the dying and the people paid to keep them alive. 3 years since her honorable discharge from the 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 years since the nightmares made every loud noise feel like incoming fire in Ramadi. 3 years since she stopped answering calls from her parents in Sacramento and started answering only to the hospital's 24-hour staffing line. The night shift was supposed to be safe. Anonymous. A place where a staff sergeant could disappear into the role of just a nurse, just someone pushing medications and checking monitors, just someone whose hands were steady and whose past stayed exactly where she'd buried it. Her patient in room 304 is 42 years old, a veteran with severe dementia and facial scarring that speaks of trauma. Sarah recognizes the way a soldier recognizes the sound of mortars in the dark. He's been declining for 6 weeks, his chart growing thicker with each shift. As she adjusts his full line, checking the flow rate against the pump display, he shifts in bed and his left forearm becomes visible. The tattoo reads SSG Sarah Chen in military stencil font, faded at the edges but unmistakable. Her hands pause for exactly 2 seconds. Just 2. Then they continue their work with perfect steadiness, checking his radial pulse, noting the rate against the cardiac monitor above his bed. "When's my nurse coming?" His voice is thin, confused. The accent is unfamiliar to him now. Memory gone. Recognition gone. The man who once carried her through enemy fire in July of 2019 looks directly at her and sees only a stranger in scrubs. "I'm here," Sarah says quietly. "I'm your nurse." He turns away. The moment passes. She documents everything with clinical precision, vital signs stable, mental status unchanged, patient comfort maintained. Pain is data. Emotion is a luxury she surrendered the day she enlisted. Her jaw clenches imperceptibly, the only visible crack in the composure that has become as automatic as breathing. The locked metal box in her locker sits exactly where it always does, untouched during her shift except for the single moment around midnight when she touches it through the metal door, her fingers pressing against the cold surface. Inside is a field journal with pressed desert flowers from Ramadi, flowers she picked under conditions that would make a normal person tremble. She doesn't open it anymore. Some memories don't need refreshing. They live in her hands, in the particular angle of her shoulders, in the way she moves through a room like someone expecting danger from any direction. But she touches the box. Once per shift. Then locks it away again. Dr. Marcus Sterling enters the ICU at 2:17 a.m. wearing his pristine white coat like a second skin, his arrival announced not by footsteps but by the sudden shift in air pressure that always precedes his presence. He's the chief of surgery at Mercy General, a man whose reputation is built on a foundation of intimidation, perfect credentials, and the absolute certainty that every person in his hospital exists to serve his vision of how medicine should be practiced. His jawline could cut glass. His eyes move across the ICU like a predator assessing which prey is easiest to isolate from the herd. He reviews Sarah's patient charts without acknowledging her, his fingers trailing across the clipboard with the casual authority of someone who has never once doubted his right to access any information he chooses. His presence makes the air pressure change. Sarah continues her work on the vital signs monitor, her movements economical, her breathing shallow. She does not look at him. She has learned that looking at Dr. Sterling is often the first step toward a confrontation she cannot win in this hierarchy. Sterling's eyes narrow as he reads something in the chart. His mouth tightens. He sets the clipboard down on the counter with a deliberate movement that is not quite a slam but carries all the weight of one. "These notes," he says, still not looking at her directly. "Who documented these patient assessments?" "I did, doctor," Sarah says. He turns then, his expression settling into something that resembles distaste. "The 4 protocols here are outside standard care parameters. The fluid balance calculations are," he pauses, as if searching for a word sufficiently cutting. "Presumptuous." Sarah's hands remain steady. Her jaw clenches imperceptibly. She says nothing. Sterling walks past her toward the medication station, his movements fluid and precise like an apex predator who knows he owns the space. The night shift nurse on the floor, Michelle, looks up from her own charting. Her body language immediately shifts toward caution. Everyone knows what Dr. Sterling's presence at 2:17 a.m. means. It means he's hunting something. It means someone is about to have a very bad morning. You know what the real problem is with nurses these days. Sterling's voice carries across the ICU floor with the casual volume of someone accustomed to being heard. Everyone gets a degree from a community college, and suddenly they think they understand complex medicine. He pauses. He does not look back. But he speaks loud enough that Sarah can hear every word with absolute clarity. Even a nursing degree from a community college comes with delusions of grandeur. The third-floor vending machine hums its mechanical rhythm behind him. No one moves. No one breathes audibly. Michelle's fingers freeze above her keyboard. The fluorescent lights buzz and flicker in a pattern that seems almost deliberate, almost conspiratorial. Sarah's hands do not shake. Her face does not flush. Her voice does not crack. She continues her documentation on the patient chart in front of her, her pen moving in steady, controlled strokes across the form. She is a trained soldier. She has survived things that would break ordinary people. She has learned that the greatest power is sometimes the power to absorb punishment and remain standing. To absorb insult and continue working. To absorb contempt and let it slide away like water off combat boots. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling turns then and walks directly to room 304, the veteran's room, the room where Sarah's patient lies in his mechanical sleep. He reviews the monitors, checks the vital signs himself with the efficiency of someone who does not trust anyone else's assessment of anything. His presence in that room feels like a violation, though Sarah cannot explain exactly why. The veteran does not wake. The monitors continue their mechanical chorus of beeps and soft alarms. When Sterling exits the room for minutes later, he does not acknowledge Sarah. He simply walks past her station and toward the elevator, his footsteps impossibly quiet for a man carrying so much authority. The elevator doors open at 2:31 a.m. He steps inside. The doors close with a soft hydraulic hiss that seems to echo across the entire floor. Sarah finishes her documentation. She moves to room 304 and checks the veterans for line again. She adjusts his pillow. She checks his pulse, counting silently against the monitor. Everything is exactly as it was before Sterling's visit. And everything has somehow changed. The hospital chapel is in the basement, 3 flights down. Sarah descends the stairs at 3:52 a.m. during her break, moving through corridors that are empty except for the occasional night shift transporter pushing a medication cart. The chapel is non-denominational, a small space with 6 rows of wooden benches and a window that overlooks the parking lot. The rain has started. It hammers against the glass like applause or like punishment, depending on how you interpret weather. She sits in the back row. Her hands begin to shake. The trembling is not fear. It is restraint finally reaching its limit. It is the accumulated weight of 3 years of invisibility, of 12 years before that in Ramadi and the adjacent locations whose names she no longer allows herself to remember. It is the weight of carrying a man 2.3 miles through enemy fire and then watching him look through her with empty eyes because his brain can no longer form the neural pathways necessary for recognition. It is the weight of being called delusional by a man who has never carried anything heavier than a pen. Her hands shake against her thighs. Her shoulders curve inward. For 47 seconds, she allows the composure to fracture. Just enough. Just in the privacy of the basement chapel where no one can see that the mask has any cracks at all. Then her breathing deepens. Her shoulders straighten. Her hands still. By the time she stands to return to the third floor, the trembling has been filed away into the same lockbox as the pressed desert flowers, carefully organized and properly stored. The night shift continues at 4:03 a.m. The hospital hums its familiar drone. Sarah Chen moves through the corridors in her pressed scrubs with the efficiency of someone who has learned to carry impossible weights. And she has no idea what is about to arrive at 2:17 a.m. on Tuesday. Thursday morning arrived with fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the underlying copper of old blood. Sarah stood in the back of the surgical conference room at Mercy General, her pressed scrubs perfectly aligned, watching the projection screen where her own handwriting appeared in magnified form, notes from the veteran in room 304, clinical assessments written at 2 a.m. when the hospital slept and clarity came easiest. Dr. Sterling stood before 12 residents, the patient chart glowing behind him like an accusation. "This," he announced, his voice pitched for the room like a surgeon lecturing on technique, "is what I call nursely overreach." He smiled. The residents shifted in their seats, pens poised. "Note how our night shift nurse has diagnosed cardiac insufficiency. Recommended medication adjustments. Essentially practice medicine without a license." He read her exact words aloud, each sentence dripping with contempt. The residents took notes furiously. Sarah's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, the muscle tightening along her temple like a door closing, but her face remained neutral, a smooth surface reflecting nothing. 6 minutes. He spent 6 full minutes dissecting her assessment, reframing her clinical observations as presumption, her careful documentation as arrogance. "Community college nurses," he continued, turning back to the residents with a theatrical gesture, "often mistake confidence for competence." Sarah's hands remained steady at her sides. The trembling would come later, in private, where it belonged. Here, in the conference room with 12 witnesses and a projector humming its mechanical drone, she was simply a night shift nurse standing silently while her judgment was dismantled like a faulty piece of equipment. Her eyes didn't leave Sterling's face, not to challenge him, but to remember. To document. Her mind moved through the interaction with military precision, timestamp, witnesses, exact phrasing. Muscle memory from a different life. The presentation ended. The residents filed out and Sarah turned to leave, but Sterling's voice followed her. "Good work, night shift. Knowing your limitations is the first step." She kept walking. That afternoon at the third-floor vending machine, Sarah arrived to find Dr. Sterling holding court with 4 interns clustered around him like residents drawn to a flame. The machine hummed its low mechanical song. Sterling was mid-sentence, his laugh preceding his words. "The problem with these community college nurses," he said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "is they watch too much Grey's Anatomy and start thinking they're surgeons." The interns laughed uncomfortably. One of them glanced toward Sarah, then away, a quick flicker of recognition, then erasure. "We call her Nurse Night Shift," Sterling continued, eyes sliding toward Sarah with calculated casualness. "Because that's where she belongs. In the dark. Where no one has to see the mistakes." Sarah inserted her dollar bill into the slot. The mechanical jaw of the vending machine opened and closed with a precision that reminded her of something, a loading mechanism, a breech block. She selected her coffee. The machine whirred and dropped the can, which landed with a soft aluminum thud. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened it, a microsecond of involuntary response, barely visible. She closed the tremor down like a fist, took a breath, and walked away without changing expression. What they didn't know was that trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the least violence of someone who'd learned not to respond to provocation. Who'd been trained to let insults slide off skin like rain on armor. But that wasn't the worst part. By Friday, Sarah discovered what Sterling had been building while she carried the weight of public humiliation. She was conducting her morning rounds when she noticed the changes to the duty roster. Her name appeared next to administrative tasks instead of direct patient care. When she tried to access the veteran's updated labs on her computer, the system required a password override. A second override. And then a third, each denial a small brick in a growing wall. She requested access through the proper channels, and the charge nurse, Margaret, met her eyes with something like pity. "Sterling called down this morning," Margaret said quietly. "Flagged your account for data security review. Says there's been some concern about scope of practice violations. I'm his assigned night nurse." "I know, honey. I know." Margaret's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Just be careful right now." Sarah nodded and walked to the medication dispensary, where the work continued. That night, the veteran's lab showed something she'd predicted 3 days ago: fluid accumulation around his heart, early signs of pericardial effusion that would progress silently if no one was watching carefully enough. She documented everything with meticulous precision, her notes clinical and detailed, each entry a small argument against the narrative Sterling was constructing. On Saturday morning, Sterling made his move. A 6 a.m. call to risk management. By 8 a.m., the 2 residents who'd witnessed her triage decisions, the ones who'd seen her competence firsthand, were reassigned to the satellite clinic across town. The roster changed again. Her access restrictions deepened, and suddenly she was requesting password overrides from charge nurses just to check her own patients' charts. The paper trail formed behind her like footprints in wet concrete, each change documented, each restriction justified by a phone call she hadn't made, a complaint she hadn't caused. Sarah moved through Mercy General with the same quiet efficiency, unchanged on the surface. She rounded on her patients. She documented her assessments. She performed her duties with the precision of someone who'd learned that protest only accelerated the inevitable. But the isolation deepened. Where other nurses clustered at the station during breaks, there was now a small distance. Not hostile, just distance. The invisible radius that forms around people who've been marked as problems. Monday brought a staff meeting where Sterling discussed her notes about the veteran's condition. "Overly anxious interpretations from non-clinical personnel," he said in front of 14 nurses and 3 physicians. "We appreciate the enthusiasm, Sarah, but cardiac assessments require medical training." Sarah stood at the back of the room, her hands folded, her expression unchanging. She'd been called out by name this time, not night shift, not a nurse night shift, but Sarah. As if she'd become less anonymous, more visible, more vulnerable. The veteran in room 304 continued to deteriorate quietly. His oxygen saturation drifted. His fluid intake shifted. His breathing patterns changed in ways that anyone paying close attention would notice. Sarah paid close attention. She documented everything in real time, wrote assessments with surgical precision, and watched Sterling dismiss them during rounds like a surgeon dismissing a medical student's concerns. Tuesday morning arrived at 2:17 a.m. Sarah was conducting her routine rounds when she entered room 304 and the entire room seemed to tilt slightly. The veteran's jugular veins were distending, standing out like cables on his neck. His breathing had shifted from steady to rapid and shallow. The cardiac monitor showed a pulsus paradoxus pattern, the pressure dropping with respiration. She glanced at his blood pressure, 87/52, and falling. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, 8 years of military medicine condensing into pure muscle memory. She hit the code button, her finger precise on the alarm. The code team was for minutes away. He didn't have for minutes. The veteran's eyes found hers across the sudden urgency of the room, and in that moment, something flickered in them, not recognition, but connection. His voice cracked like old leather. "Tell my nurse I waited for her." Sarah's jaw tightened once, a single beat of emotion, and then her hands went to work. She pulled the crash cart, her movements efficient and practiced. The 18-gauge needle was in her fingers before conscious thought. The 60 cubic centimeters syringe. Her fingers found the landmarks on his chest, the 5th intercostal space, below the xiphoid process, the subcostal approach for what the textbooks called emergency pericardiocentesis but what she called keeping someone alive who shouldn't be dying alone at 2:17 a.m. A red light blinked steadily in the corner of the room. The security camera, always recording, always watching. Sterling would review that footage within the hour. The monitor's rhythm had been deteriorating for hours, irregular, stuttering, a heartbeat coming apart at the seams. Sarah noticed it at 1:47 a.m. when she checked on the veteran, the one with her name etched into his scarred forearm. His breathing was shallow. His neck veins were distended like electrical cords pulling tight beneath the skin. She'd flagged it in the chart. Documented it. Sent the assessment to the day shift with clinical precision, the words meticulous and bulletproof, recommend cardiology consult. Patient presenting with signs consistent with pericardial effusion. Recommend urgent evaluation. Dr. Sterling had read her note at 6 a.m. during morning rounds. He'd said nothing. He'd simply moved to the next patient, his silence more cutting than any words. At 2:17 a.m. on Tuesday, 30 hours later, the veteran's blood pressure dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. The systolic reading fell from 110 to 95 to 78 to 62. Sarah was at the bedside, had been checking vitals every 30 minutes since midnight because something in her bones knew. The kind of knowing that comes from training, from muscle memory, from having spent for years reading the body's language when every second of misreading meant someone didn't come home. "Help," the veteran whispered. His hand reached for her arm, his empty eyes suddenly aware for the first time in months. "Help me." Sarah's jaw tightened. No tremor. No hesitation. She pressed the call bell for the code team, then moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before under fire. The 4 was already in place. She grabbed the crash cart, the equipment moving against her hands like an extension of herself. Her fingers found the landmarks, the xiphoid process at the base of his sternum, the space below it, the angle toward his left shoulder. She didn't ask permission. There wasn't time for permission. There was only the widening space between breathing and not breathing, between living and the flatline silence that follows. The 18-gauge needle slid into her palm from the crash cart. Her hand was steady as surgical steel. The veteran's chest rose with shallow, panicked breaths. Sarah's breathing didn't change. "This will help," she said quietly, the only words that mattered. She advanced the needle through the skin, through the layers of muscle and fascia, angling it precisely as she'd been taught in the field, as she'd practiced on models and dummies and in her mind 1,000 times since hanging up her uniform. The needle moved in millimeter increments. There was a slight resistance, then a subtle pop as the needle pierced through to the pericardium, that tough membrane that surrounds the heart like a sealed envelope filling with blood. The first syringe drew back against the plunger. Dark blood came. Not red, dark, oxygen-depleted blood that shouldn't have been there, blood that had pooled around his heart and slowly, steadily compressed it until the organ couldn't beat properly. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis she'd written in the chart. The one Sterling had ignored. 20 ccs. 40 ccs. The veteran's breathing eased infinitesimally. His hand relaxed against the mattress. 60 ccs. She switched syringes, continuing the aspiration in smooth, practiced motions. 80 ccs. 100 ccs. The jugular veins began to flatten, no longer engorged and bulging against the thin skin of his neck. 120 ccs. She withdrew the needle and disposed of it in the sharps container in one fluid motion. The entire procedure had taken 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The blood pressure monitor beeped, 95/60. Rising. His oxygen saturation climbed, 88%, 91%, 94%. The cardiac rhythm, which had been chaotic and irregular, steadied into a recognizable pattern. The room's tension didn't dissipate immediately, it hung there for another breath, another second, but the acute crisis had shifted. The patient was no longer dying. Not yet. The code team arrived at minute 4. They'd been somewhere else in the hospital, running to another emergency, and had missed the worst of it. A resident, a nurse, an attending physician who worked the trauma rotation and had seen things that made most people's nightmares look tame. They stopped at the threshold of the room, processing the sight, the blood-filled syringes arranged in a precise line, the patient stabilizing before their eyes, the nurse standing calmly beside the bed as though she'd just checked a blood pressure instead of performing a procedure that belonged in an operating room or a chest tube setup. The attending physician was a man named Marcus Chen, no relation to Sarah, who'd been in Kandahar for 2 deployments and had learned to recognize competence the way other people recognized their own faces. He looked at the syringes. He looked at the monitor. He looked at Sarah's expression, which showed nothing but professional composure, a mask so complete it might have been made of stone. "You just performed a pericardiocentesis," he said. It wasn't quite a question. His voice held something between recognition and disbelief. "The patient presented with cardiac tamponade," Sarah replied, her tone exactly level, exactly professional. There wasn't time to wait. Dr. Chen opened his mouth. Closed it. Then nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture, and turned to begin postcode documentation. The resident beside him was pale, staring at the blood-filled syringes as if they'd materialized from another dimension. The nurse from the code team moved to Sarah's side without a word and began helping with cleanup, a gesture that meant something, that acknowledged something without speaking it aloud. Sarah returned to her other patients. She finished her rounds at 6:30 a.m., updating charts, documenting vitals, charting the medication she'd given to 2 other patients down the hall. At 7 a.m., she turned over her shift to the day nurse with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, a summary of each patient's status, any interventions, anything the day shift needed to know. She mentioned the pericardiocentesis with the same neutral tone she used to report blood pressure readings. The day shift nurse's eyes widened. "You did what now?" "The patient had cardiac tamponade," Sarah said. "The attending approved it. It's documented." She clocked out at 7:15 a.m. The morning was beginning to grey at the edges, the parking lot still dark but no longer the impenetrable black of true night. She drove home to her small apartment on Victory Drive, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen where she never cooked, and sat on her bed still wearing her scrubs because changing felt like acknowledging something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The procedure had been correct. The outcome had been correct. The veteran would live because of her decision to act. But she'd crossed a line. She knew it. The line between what a nurse is permitted to do and what a nurse with a different training, a different history, a different set of skills was capable of doing. Sterling would know it too. At 7:45 a.m., 45 minutes after Sarah left the hospital, Dr. Sterling sat at his desk on the 4th floor with the security footage queued up on his computer. The angle was poor but adequate, 2 cameras covering the veteran's room from different positions. He watched Sarah approach the crash cart. Watched her select the needle. Watched her hands move through the procedure with a precision that belonged in an operating theater. He watched 3 times in succession. His expression hardened with each viewing. Not surprise. Not the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something unexpected. The hardening was something else, the look of a man watching a threat materialize on a screen, a threat that had taken on physical form and couldn't be dismissed or reframed. By 8:30 a.m., he'd made 4 phone calls. The first was to risk management, a woman named Patricia Holloway who'd worked at Mercy General for 17 years and knew the liability landscape like a general knows a battlefield. He presented it as a grave concern, a nurse performing procedures outside her scope of practice, a potential violation of the medical board standards, a serious question about credentialing and supervision. The second call was to the medical board liaison, a man named Dr. Reeves who'd worked with Sterling on several committees and owed him a favor or 3 from past collaborations. Sterling framed it carefully, an urgent matter requiring documentation, a potential breach that might need to be reported. The third call was to the hospital administrator, a woman named Sarah Vance who spent most of her time managing budgets and liability and had learned to fear anything that smelled like a lawsuit. Sterling presented it as a proactive measure. He discovered a serious protocol violation and wanted to handle it internally before any external parties became aware. The fourth call was to the chief nursing officer, Dr. Helen Martinez, who'd been at Mercy General for 9 years and had never particularly liked Sterling but understood the political cost of crossing him. By 10 a.m., he'd personally reviewed the previous week's duty logs. he altered the entries to show Sarah had been scheduled for administrative tasks on several shifts when he'd actually assigned her direct patient care. He created a discrepancy between what she'd been authorized to do and what the logs would show. It was subtle enough to withstand cursory inspection but obvious enough to support his narrative of an overstep, a violation, a nurse exceeding her authority. By 11 a.m., he'd scheduled the termination meeting for noon. The rubber soles of his shoes squeaked against the polished hallway floor as he walked to his office. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, grating song, a sound most people stopped hearing after a few weeks but that never quite faded for anyone listening closely enough. He closed his office door and sat in the darkness for a moment, his hands folded on his desk. Then he began to speak aloud, rehearsing the exact words he would use. "We've discovered a serious violation of scope of practice protocols. We've documented your performance of procedures reserved exclusively for physicians. We have security footage. We have inconsistencies in your duty log that suggest you knew you were exceeding your authorization. We have no choice but to terminate your employment immediately for gross violation of hospital policy and your professional license agreement." He said the words again, adjusting the cadence, the emphasis, the theatrical precision he'd learned from watching other administrators fire people over the years. He wanted to sound regretful but firm. Shocked but professional. A man forced into an unpleasant decision by the weight of evidence and protocol. By 11:45 a.m., he'd rehearsed the speech 4 times. He'd reviewed the altered duty logs one final time. He'd confirmed the presence of 2 HR witnesses. He'd prepared a box for her to collect her personal items from her locker. He'd arranged for security to escort her out of the building if she became emotional or argumentative. He had no idea that every single detail she'd documented in that chart, the cardiac assessment, the recommendation for cardiology consult, the progression of his own medication error from 3 weeks prior that she'd caught and carefully noted, would become the evidence that would end his career. But in that moment, at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Dr. Marcus Sterling felt something very close to victory. A threat eliminated. An order restored. A nurse taught a lesson about knowing her place. He smiled at his reflection in the darkened computer monitor. He shouldn't have. Dr. Sterling's phone call to the hospital's risk management director came at 6:17 a.m. on Saturday, while the sun was still painting Savannah's Spanish moss in shades of orange and gold. He sat in his office with the security footage paused on his computer screen, the moment Sarah's hands moved with that terrifying fluid precision, the needle sliding in, the hiss of air escaping the pericardial sac like a breath being released. He watched it 3 times before picking up the phone. His voice was measured, almost casual, the tone of a superior sharing a regrettable discovery with a colleague. "I need to report a serious protocol violation," he said. "One of our night shift nurses performed an invasive cardiac procedure without physician supervision. Pericardiocentesis. On a patient under my care." He didn't mention that she'd saved the patient's life in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He didn't mention that every resident on that floor knew she'd predicted this exact complication 4 days earlier. Instead, he spoke about scope of practice, about liability, about the hospital's exposure to Joint Commission violations and Medicare penalties. The risk management director listened, took notes, asked questions. By the time Sterling hung up, the machinery was in motion. The 2 residents who'd been present in the room when Sarah performed the procedure received their rotation reassignments by 8 a.m., a simple administrative email rerouting them to day shift work in the orthopedic ward, far from the trauma bay, far from any opportunity to testify about what they'd witnessed. Sterling sent the email himself, noting that their development would benefit from broader surgical exposure and that night shift experience is often overvalued in resident training. It was competent work, the kind of institutional maneuvering that left no fingerprints, that could be explained away as routine scheduling if anyone asked. No one would ask. By 9:30 a.m., Sterling was in the hospital's records room with the night shift duty log spread across a laminated table. He made 3 changes with a pen and a steady hand. Sarah's name moved from patient care, trauma bay to administrative tasks, supply inventory, eliminating any documentation that she'd been assigned to clinical work during the period in question. The pencil marks he erased with the practiced precision of someone who'd done this before, not destroying evidence, merely correcting administrative errors. The kind of small adjustments that happen in every hospital, every day, that no one investigates because they seem too minor to matter. By the time he finished, the paperwork told a story where Sarah Chen had been nowhere near a patient's bedside when the cardiac tamponade occurred. The paperwork lied. At 10:15 a.m., Sterling called the IT department and requested that Sarah's electronic medical records access be restricted immediately, citing security protocols surrounding terminated staff. The request was processed without question. Her username locked. Her password disabled. Her ability to view charts, write notes, or access patient information simply ceased to exist in the hospital's digital infrastructure. It was a signal, a message in institutional language: you are being erased. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the precision of it. Sterling had spent 6 hours building a structure where Sarah Chen's actions existed in a legal grey zone, where her heroism became professional overreach, where saving a life looked like exceeding her authority. He'd done it without raising his voice. Without a single email that could be characterized as retaliation. The machinery of the institution itself would now crush her, and Sterling would be the one to pull the lever. At exactly noon on Saturday, Sarah was called to Dr. Sterling's office. She walked down the hallway with her coffee in one hand, unaware that her employment had already been terminated in the minds of 3 men who sat waiting for her. Sterling's office was cold, not from air conditioning but from something else, something that made the air pressure feel different. The HR director sat on Sterling's left, a woman named Valdez with the careful expression of someone trained to witness uncomfortable conversations without appearing complicit. The risk management officer occupied the chair to Sterling's right, her grey suit matching her grey expression. They looked like a tribunal. "Ms. Chen," Sterling said, using her last name without courtesy, without her title, "you are terminated effective immediately for gross violation of scope of practice protocols and performing procedures reserved exclusively for physicians." He slid a termination letter across his desk with 2 fingers, as though it might contaminate him. "The fact that the patient survived is irrelevant. You do not have the authority to perform invasive cardiac procedures. That is not in question here." Sarah's face remained perfectly composed. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly, though something flickered in her eyes, not fear, not anger, but a kind of recognition. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital, but in a briefing room in Kandahar, when a commander had looked her in the eye and told her that everything she'd done in Ramadi was being reclassified. She'd learned then not to fight. Not to argue. Not to give them the satisfaction of watching her break. "I have 14 years of trauma medicine experience," she said quietly. As a nurse, Sterling cut her off, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "Not as a physician. There's a distinction." He handed her a cardboard box. A final paycheck. A stack of forms to sign. The machinery of institutional closure, clean and efficient and absolute. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You have 15 minutes. Patterson, the hospital's veteran security guard, appeared in the doorway as though he'd been waiting just outside. He was a 60-year-old former Marine with scar tissue around his knuckles and eyes that had seen things that left permanent marks. He'd worked night shift at Mercy General for 8 years, long enough to watch Sarah save a patient in cardiac arrest using only her hands and her knowledge. Long enough to know what competence looked like when it moved through a hospital at 2 a.m. without drawing attention to itself. He handed her the box without meeting Sterling's eyes, but his jaw was tight enough that a muscle worked beneath the skin. Sarah emptied her locker in silence. The locked metal box containing her field journal, pressed desert flowers from Ramadi still tucked between the pages, never to be opened at work, never to be seen, kept only as a private reminder that some things you carry forever. Her spare shoes. Her stethoscope, the one she'd paid for herself because the hospital ones never balanced quite right against her neck. She left her name badge on top of the empty locker and walked out through the staff entrance without looking back. At 3 a.m., she sat in an empty diner on Abercorn Street, the only customer, her coffee growing cold in a white ceramic mug. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like fluorescent lights in every diner in America, indifferent to human suffering. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back, hands with calluses that came from holding trauma shears and pushing medications and carrying wounded soldiers 2 miles through enemy fire. A woman who had walked away from the army when the nightmares became unbearable, who had told no one where she went, not her parents in Sacramento, not her childhood friends, not anyone who could possibly find her. She had chosen nursing specifically to disappear, to become invisible, to help people without the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders every single second. She wondered if she would ever stop running from the person she used to be. The thought didn't make her cry. It just made her stare at the reflection longer, at the woman who had tried so hard to be nobody, to be just a nurse, to fade into the background of other people's lives. Her phone sat silent on the table. No one knew where she was. No one was coming. She had made certain of that, had spent 3 years ensuring that no one from her past could ever find her, ever know what she'd become, ever see the scars under her sleeves. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking, a gesture so mundane, so human, that it almost broke something. Sarah nodded once in acknowledgement, her composure holding like a dam holding back water. Outside, rain had begun to fall on Savannah, gentle and steady, washing the city clean of Saturday's accumulated heat and dust. Inside the diner, time moved differently. Seconds felt like hours. The reflection in the window looked like a ghost. And then, 5 days later, everything changed. 5 days later, the phone rang at 2 in the afternoon while Sarah was cleaning out her apartment on Victory Drive, wrapping her stethoscope in newspaper like it was something fragile that needed protection. Her former charge nurse, Marcus, didn't bother with pleasantries. "We have a mass casualty event. 6-car pileup on IU-95. They're desperate. They need experienced hands." The pause that followed carried the weight of what he wasn't saying. They needed her, despite the termination letter, despite the way Dr. Sterling had erased her from the duty roster. Sarah stood in her kitchen, holding the phone against her ear, the wrapped stethoscope still in her other hand. "I was terminated." "I know. Come anyway. Please." She heard the ER chaos behind him, monitors beeping in rapid succession, voices calling out vital signs, the sound of trauma doors being thrown open. 3 years of night shifts had trained her to recognize that particular pitch of organized emergency. She was at Mercy General in 17 minutes. The ER was a controlled catastrophe. Stretchers lined the hallway. Nurses moved with the efficient precision of people who'd trained for exactly this scenario but hoped never to see it. Sarah checked in at the front desk where the security guard, Patterson, the one who'd handed her the termination box, looked up and nodded without surprise. "Room 304's got an incoming trauma. Arab male, 62, respiratory distress, possible shrapnel wounds." Sarah moved toward the trauma bay, her muscle memory taking over, hands already reaching for the proper PPE. The ER smelled like diesel fuel and antiseptic and something metallic she recognized as blood mixed with rain. Thunder rumbled outside as the storm continued its assault on the city. The Iraqi man was being wheeled into room 304 when Sarah reached the bay. His eyes found hers in the chaos, and for a moment, just a moment, the room seemed to compress around them both. His voice was barely a whisper, accented and fractured with pain, but the words landed with the force of a defibrillator shock. "Al-Qitters. The cat." The code name the insurgents had given her. The name whispered in Ramadi when she'd evaded their ambush, carrying Martinez through 2.3 miles of enemy fire, her hand steady on his body weight, her breathing controlled even as rounds punched through the air around them. Sarah's jaw tightened, barely perceptible, emotion so small only someone trained to read minute physiological responses would catch it, and she moved toward the patient as though nothing had shifted in the universe. Patterson was standing 3 feet away when the implications hit him. His eyes widened as he watched Sarah move with the absolute authority of someone who'd done this under actual fire, not just in training scenarios. He watched her assess the Iraqi man's respiratory status with the kind of clinical precision that came from field medicine, from knowing that hesitation meant body bags. 2 minutes later, Patterson stepped out of the trauma bay and made a phone call. Not a hospital administration. "Higher." to the VA liaison who'd been conducting accreditation reviews. And that call triggered something that had already been waiting in motion for exactly this moment. 90 minutes. That's how long it took for the two-star general to arrive at Mercy General in a staff car that pulled up to the ER entrance with the kind of authority that made people instinctively stand straighter. General Rebecca Morrison was conducting site visits to Savannah area facilities as part of the Veterans Affairs Oversight Program, and she'd been briefed on something unusual by the VA liaison, a nurse at this hospital, formerly Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment, whose termination had occurred 5 days after a life-saving intervention that exceeded her official scope of practice. The general had decided to see for herself. She stood in the crowded ER corridor at 4:47 p.m., her uniform crisp and her presence possessing that particular quality of authority that comes from having held the power to send people into combat and make decisions that change the course of wars. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless mechanical song overhead. 30 people stopped moving when the general raised her voice, reading from a tablet that one of her aides had handed her. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment. Bronze Star. She paused, letting the words settle like stones into still water. Second Bronze Star with Valor. Another pause. The ER had gone completely silent. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. The general looked directly at Sarah, who was still in the trauma bay but visible through the glass, and then she read the final line. Field report indicates Staff Sergeant Chen neutralized for enemy combatants while carrying a wounded soldier 2.3 miles under sustained fire in Ramadi, July 2019. The silence in that moment wasn't the absence of sound. It was the sound of 30 people recalibrating their understanding of the night shift nurse they'd worked alongside for 3 years. In room 304, the veteran with dementia, Martinez, was seated in a wheelchair while they prepped him for transfer to the specialized VA facility. His name was embroidered on his hospital bracelet in small, careful letters, but it was the tattoo on his left forearm that held the real information. He'd been staring at nothing, lost in the fog of advanced cognitive decline, when something flickered behind his eyes. Clarity. Just a moment of it, like a light switch flipping on briefly before dimming again. He lifted his scarred arm, twisted it so he could see the tattoo clearly. His voice cracked as he whispered, "She died so I could live. Carried me when she should have left me." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain hammering against the windows. Sarah stood absolutely still, her composure a wall that didn't waver, didn't show a crack. Inside, something that had been locked away for 3 years was breaking open. But her face remained professional, neutral, the mask of a military operative who'd learned that showing emotion in the field got people killed. The doors to the ER burst open and Dr. Sterling walked through with his expression already prepared, the expression of a man about to defend his professional decisions to hospital administrators. He stopped short when he saw the general in her uniform, when he saw the crowd of staff and patients, when he saw Sarah Chen standing among them with a kind of presence he'd never noticed before. His pale face went paler. The general turned to face him with the expression of a woman who has just identified a threat to her people. "Dr. Sterling." "Chief of Surgery." Sterling nodded, his mouth opening and closing without sound at first. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its sharp edge. "Yes. And while I'm sure Staff Sergeant Chen's service is commendable, it doesn't change the fact that she violated scope of practice protocols when she..." The general cut him off with a gesture so small it was barely visible. "The VA liaison has been reviewing your hospital's treatment protocols for veteran patients over the past 6 months." She nodded to a woman in a business suit standing 10 feet away, who stepped forward with a tablet. "We found 17 instances of substandard care in veteran patient files. 12 of those cases were corrected by nursing staff interventions. Interventions documented by Sarah Chen before you systematically blocked her access to patient records." Sterling's hands began to tremble. The tablet scrolled through file after file. "Your medication error from last Friday. That's the 3rd dosage calculation error in your record this quarter. The State Medical Board has been notified." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the form of facts too overwhelming to argue against. Patterson stepped forward, and in his hands was a cardboard box identical to the one he'd handed Sarah 5 days earlier. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire ER like a bell. "Dr. Sterling, I believe you know the way out, sir." The crowd parted silently. Sterling took the box with shaking hands and walked toward the exit, and Sarah watched him go with the calm of someone who'd learned long ago that some victories taste like nothing at all because vengeance never satisfies the way you think it will. General Morrison approached Sarah as the crowd began to disperse, as medical staff returned to their tasks, as the emergency continued in its controlled chaos. "You walked away from the army," the general said quietly, standing close enough that only Sarah could hear her. "Not many Rangers do that voluntarily." Sarah's composure held, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement, of truth finally being spoken aloud. "The nightmares were unbearable, sir. Every loud noise felt like incoming fire. I needed to disappear." The general nodded slowly. "And nursing let you help people without the weight of command." Sarah's hands remained steady, but if you looked closely, you could see the trembling that wasn't fear, it was restraint. "I told no one where I went. Not even my parents in Sacramento. I just needed to vanish." General Morrison placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, and the gesture carried decades of understanding. "Well, Staff Sergeant, you didn't disappear well enough. You left a trail of saved lives." By autumn, when the State Medical Board's review of Dr. Sterling's record was complete, he'd accepted a settlement and a resignation. The only position the hospital could offer him was night security, a position he took because he had nothing else left. 3 nights a week, Sarah Chen walked past the security desk where he sat monitoring cameras, and he buzzed her through without making eye contact. The field journal with pressed desert flowers from Ramadi remained in her locked car's glove compartment where it had always been, a private reminder that some things you carry forever, whether or not anyone knows you're carrying them. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your history, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment. Would you have walked away from Sarah when Sterling did, or would you have believed in her?